We've been talking about the effect of trauma. We've been talking about addiction. We've been talking about shame and guilt. Tonight, we're going to be talking about grief and how we deal with loss. I'm Roy Burley.
And I'm Esther Branco-Diaz, and welcome to part 3 of how to turn a toxic past into a purposeful now. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Trust Talks by the Purim Trust. First off, I want to say, sorry we're late. We had a few little technical issues, but we're with you now. So welcome. If you're joining us already, it's great to have you with us. If you're watching this later on, then we hope something of what we share this evening will help encourage hope in your heart that there is a way to a purposeful life right now. So welcome. It's good to see you, Roy.
Good to see you, Esther.
I hope you're doing okay.
I'm doing well.
Good. Roy's over there in Shropshire.
Sunny Shropshire.
Sunny Shropshire, and I'm here in not so sunny Suffolk. But welcome. As we mentioned before, this is the 3rd part in our series. And tonight we're talking about grief. And I have to say, Roy, actually, for some reason, I feel a bit more not worried about this one, but I think I'm going to find this quite difficult, which has surprised me as I've been preparing this week. So we're going on this journey together. And with those of you who are watching, give us a wave if you're there. Let us know that you're tuning in because we really appreciate your support. And tonight we're going to be diving into grief, talking about grief, the effects of grief, what it feels like, and grief in relation to trauma, as Roy mentioned, which can sometimes occur. So when we were looking at this subject, I came across this quote from C.S. Lewis. And he said that no one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. And as soon as I read that, I thought, yes, that is how I experienced the feeling of grief after the loss of my mum. So that really impacted me. Hi, Lee. Thank you for saying hello. Hello, Beverley, for the wave.
Hi, Bev.
So yeah, that quote from C.S. Lewis really impacted me because I thought, yes, I can identify with that. So want to ask you, what does grief feel like to you? How would you describe it? What would be your explanation of the feeling of grief? Let us know your thoughts. I also found this quote from J.K. Rowling, which said, "You care so much, you feel as though you will bleed to death from the pain of it." And again, I identified with that. Most extreme form. And grief, as we know, is our response to loss, and not necessarily to someone. It can be something. And I know that I've experienced grief at different times in my life, but I'm also aware that it's not just something that happens emotionally to us. It can be a physical feeling, a physical effect. It can affect our behavior, our thought processes, our thinking, and it can have an effect on us spiritually as well as physically, mentally, emotionally. So we're going to be looking at some of that this evening. Hi, Princess. Great to have you joining us.
Hey, Princess.
So God bless you both. Thank you. We bless you back. Thanks for tuning in. And to those of you else who are tuning in as well, we're going to be diving straight into this subject in a minute. But can I ask you a favor, for those of you who are watching either live or later on, can you hit the subscribe button, or give us a like or even a share, because we want YouTube to know that there are people interested in discussing some sensitive issues, but with the purpose of building hope and pointing towards hope. So if you can hit the subscribe and like and even a share, then that would really help get some positive stuff onto YouTube, even though we're talking about some difficult things. Yeah.
I think, Esther, when you came up with this idea of Trust Talks and asked me to go on this journey with you, I had no idea how hard it would be doing this. I don't think you did either. We felt it was important, but actually to get out here and do it and go public and talk about our lives and sensitive issues, it's no joke, is it?
No.
So
It's really challenging. And I think also it's surprising actually which subjects, like this one I wasn't expecting to be, there's still pain there, or
yeah,
you've been talking about some really difficult things, and actually it is very challenging.
yeah, it really it kind of suddenly these emotions begin to arise, and also the vulnerability that we have. And but it's been amazing. I've been really happy for those who, like Leah and Princess and Bev and Hannah and all these others that we've been coming on this journey with us, and others who I haven't mentioned. I felt like that's been really important, just having that. I felt supported, like just having them there, and
Definitely.
that there's been quite not a load of people, but the odd person that has been helped by this, and they've kind of expressed like this has caused them to ask for help, and I've been trying to help and been helping people because of this program, Esther.
Yeah, which is great,
So,
because that's what we said in the beginning. It's not necessarily how many people see this, but it's just about the right people who need it at the right time. So that's really
yeah,
encouraging that people are
yeah.
getting some help.
Yeah, so I think it's important, but it's not easy to do. But Esther, so I'm aware that this is a journey, and I honor you tonight in this journey. But could you share a bit about your experience of grief?
Yes, I think we touched on it briefly sort of in the first weeks, and probably a bit about trauma actually that I shared about my mum having cancer and her death from it, which was a slow, long, drawn out process. And I think in the process of grieving the loss of my mum, I hadn't really realised that I was experiencing trauma as well. The two things combined. Um, but I would describe grief actually in my life at the loss of my mum as the most painful experience I've ever been through. And when I share that, I've already shared that I've been abused and lots of bad stuff physically has happened to me in my life. But the loss of my mum, actually, I would describe as the worst pain I've ever experienced in my life. And like we shared before, it was physical, it was mental, it was emotional. This pain in my heart was physical.
Yeah,
um, and I think that's difficult enough, losing someone that you're particularly close with. And it's different for everyone. But I was exceptionally close with my mum. She was like my best friend, my confidant, my favorite person to be with, the person that I would share everything with. And I wasn't married at that time. And I guess also I was believing that she was going to be well, that she wasn't going to die. so I wasn't prepared for that either. I'm not even sure how you can prepare for loss, but I think, yeah, I don't really know how else to explain it other than that. And I think combined with the traumatic experience of nursing my mum through cancer and physically taking care of her, and her not going into a hospice and making the decisions about her care, you know, physically helping to maintain her bodily functions, and, you know, even then decisions that I made about her care. And also then, you know, even like I washed her body after she died and cleaned her and prepared her. Those aren't things that normally, not everyone goes through that when
Yeah.
someone dies. So I didn't really allow myself to process the traumatic experience of watching someone die. But the grief was all consuming. I I felt like I wanted to die myself. I felt guilty that I was living and I was well. And this might sound very extreme to some people who've not experienced grief or not even been in the depths of grief like that. They might think, well, why does it get so bad? And I can remember just losing the will to live myself, not eating. There was nothing good left, is how I saw it.
Mm.
The rest of my life was totally ruined. That even if I did go on to have good things happen in my life, they would always be spoiled because my mum wouldn't be there. And I think, summing up, you know, briefly explaining what it felt like for me, that's how I would describe it. Um, and we're not very good in this country, I think, at allowing time for grief. I
Yeah.
was back to I was running my own business. I was back to work really quickly, and there's this assumption that you should just pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and be okay, and be positive about it. I think there's a lot of pressure in our culture not to grieve, not to cry. Um, but for me, I didn't just grieve, I went into total despair.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I would
Yeah.
describe it.
I mean, that's some really interesting points that you're highlighting. I think, you know, for those who are working as well, like if, you know, you get such little time off work for grief. And if you look historically in Bible times and historical cultures, ancient cultures, they always had about a month to just mourn and just
Mm,
release this pain. But there's very little in our British culture that allows for that. I mean, even in my background is Irish and Jamaican, as you know, both of our cultures, we allow for expressing grief, you
mm,
know. You know, when my all the people that died in my life, my sister, my dad, my mum, we had their bodies in the home. And then that's an Irish thing and a Caribbean thing, you know, and we call it a wake.
mm,
And the whole community comes and the family, and they sit for days with the family, and you face that death,
mm.
and then, you know, so it's interesting that we, even the whole funeral thing, like if someone dies, you have to it's like organizing a wedding dead quick, isn't it? I
Yeah,
mean, it's no joke how
yeah,
the amount of work in organizing a funeral. So like you said, for you, there's no time to grieve, there's no time, so you're almost still in shock.
yeah,
And I think a lot of us, we're still in shock, and then you hit the ground running because you got to get back to work. And so everything, you have to just contain everything, lock it all
mhm,
up again, and get on with it.
yeah.
But then it
Yeah,
seeps out, doesn't it? Did you find that, Esther?
yeah, and I was amazed actually how even you know, even at my mum's funeral, and you know, we had what we, I guess, in our culture now, a wake has become like the food bit after the funeral service. And
Yeah.
even there, people saying to me, well, let's celebrate and let's praise now because your mum's in a better place. And I totally agree with that. I'm really blessed by the fact that my mum believed in Jesus, and I believe that I know where she is, and that I will see her again. There is a comfort in that, but there still is this grieving and mourning over the separation and the loss, and I felt really angry about that at my mum's
Yeah.
wake. Well, let's just celebrate now. No tears, put a smile on your face and, be nice and strong like your mum would want you to be. And the amount of pressure, just even in that day, like if I can't grieve my mum on this day, on her funeral day, then when can I? And
Yeah.
yeah, lost this expression of grief. And I think it's so healthy. We have tears for a purpose, they're a release. We're meant to have a time of grieving and mourning, and then we move on. And I think that's so healthy in other cultures, and we've lost that.
Yeah. And there's very I as you know, Esther, probably not everyone knows this, but I experience facing death, you know, in the work I do, often. Tomorrow I
Yeah.
have to go and help at a funeral. So uh, in my community, the funeral director lives, and so when someone dies locally and he's on call in the middle of the night, I go help him pick them up. So I'm forever seeing people, even in my own community, dying, waving to him one week, and then the next week I'm at their house, and I've had to watch death. You know, I have to watch death constantly, and what I'm aware of in our society is you don't really see anything. It's very clinical, um, and so everything it's not you don't really see the reality, and in our society we don't really want to see it. Someone else just comes and takes them, and they don't even really see them. We let them say goodbye, and then we put them in another room and we take them away, and the next time they'll see them, like in my culture, we would always open the coffin as well on the day, and
Mm.
everyone could look and see and come to terms with what is. And I think something in our culture does not want to experience loss. It doesn't want to face the reality of loss. So what we do is we make it as clinical as possible, and we just keep going. That's the thing. Stiff upper lip, keep going. But Esther, that type of way of dealing with grief, how did it seep out in your everyday life? What was the effects of you got to be strong, you need to celebrate, your mum's in a better place, get on with it? What did that do?
Well, I think I felt very angry by comments like that. I think there was an internal anger which at times turned to bitterness, even seeing other people, other women with their mum, or there's something about grief that we're less able to talk about, because what I learned quite quickly is if I said to someone, I'm really struggling today, just really missing my mum, or with the loss of, or the things that I saw, um, most people's response is, yeah, but she's not in pain now, or you've just got to look forward, or there's no, okay, well, let's talk about that. It's
Yeah,
something that people need to quickly brush over or make you feel better about. And I feel it's less understood, and I think that's why I was thinking about talking about it this evening, is because of the responses that I've had from people years ago when I wanted to talk about my mum, or I wanted to talk about grief. Interestingly, it's almost people are more sympathetic to you if you say, oh, I had experienced difficulties as a child growing up. Oh, right, tell me about that. But grief, no, people don't want to discuss it, I don't think, and don't know how to respond to someone who's grieving. And in my life, I think I was in a state of inner despair over the loss of my mum for a long time. And I learned very well to contain it, like I've done with lots of things in my life, to grieve in private and quietly. And on those days where I couldn't cope with it, I would cancel what I needed to do. I'd have to put my face on at work. But I stayed in that place of despair for a long time. And it had big effects in my life. It became very isolating, actually. Grief
Yeah.
isolates, I think.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned an element of you wasn't expecting her to die. And we who come from a place of faith, that can get really tricky. Like, I don't know what your experience with that was, but for me, my sister, I remember when my sister, so I just grew up, believing the Bible. I did not know how not to believe it because I was taught it. I was taught this is true. God wants us well and God raises the dead even. So when my sister was sick, I had, and she was in a coma. There was not a single thought in me that she would die. I
Yeah.
just did not believe it was possible because we were people of faith.
Yeah.
And then even when she died, Esther, I was 15 years of age. And I phoned the pastor and I said, because in those days we always used olive oil to anoint the sick and everything. And I said, Pastor, I said, my sister's died, but it's okay. Just bring the oil and we'll raise her back because Jesus raised the dead.
Yeah.
And I was shocked when he said, Brother Rai, she's gone. I was like, no.
Mm.
So, and I think a lot of us who are coming from a faith, I mean, other people listening to this who have not grown up in a Christian context or a faith context like this will think we're bonkers, and I get that. But for us, this is real, isn't it? Like, and when someone dies, did you like some people that I've talked to have got faith? They almost blame themselves, like, my mom died. Did I not have enough faith?
Yeah. Totally. And the same as you, like I was fully believing that my mum was going to be healed. That's how we describe it in our faith, that she was going to fully recover, be fully well, and wouldn't even contemplate the fact that she might die. She stopped going for treatment, stopped going to see doctors because she believed, and we believed, that she was going to be well. And so when that doesn't happen, yes, it makes you question everything. But I think the prolonged response, the immediate response was, I didn't do it right.
Mm.
There was something wrong with my faith, maybe something wrong with the way I prayed. I failed her, which adds a whole other element, doesn't it, to grief anyway?
It's so unfair as well to
Yeah.
to to feel to now, because I was talking about I took the blame as a youngster. That's to take the blame for somebody who you dearly love dying.
Mm,
That is so hard.
yeah.
I'm not sure people are aware of, some of us who have faith, how hard that is for us and what that's like. But I'm sure there's people here who have tried to really believe for their loved ones and they haven't seen them healed, and they blame themselves.
Mhm.
And that's not right, Esther.
No, and definitely not. And I just feel those feelings so vividly that if anyone else is going through that right now, my heart goes out to them, because grieving is hard enough. That separation from the person that you love and the loss, or having to witness them suffering, and how they die. But to add to that, that feeling of responsibility is too much. And I think that's what really took me to that place of despair. All of those elements, it's it's very hard. I think that's why I would describe it as the most painful thing I've ever experienced in my life.
Yeah.
Um, and I can remember though, Roy, something that was really helpful that you shared with me actually a few years on after the loss of my mum, because I would go through, we've talked about some of the responses to grief. There can be anger, denial, guilt, bitterness. Um, and then you can start to, sometimes it can just ease a little bit. And when you look at stuff online about the stages of grief or what happens in grief, usually that's how they describe it, that you go through those really difficult stages, but then it starts to get better. But then I would go right back into the grief and the pain and the despair again, and just feeling like I was right back in the beginning, sometimes years on.
Yeah.
And then beating myself up of like, well, I'm meant to be able to deal with this better by now. But it's also that it's a frightening feeling, grief, because you can't imagine ever feeling better or ever feeling like there's going to be hope. But everything I looked at online was like, well, it will be really bad and then give it time and it will get better. And I would go back into it. And I can remember once just saying to you, I should be able to feel better by now. And you shared about how grief comes in waves. It's waves of grief. So, yeah, it will come really hard and deep and dark and overwhelming, but then it recedes and it eases a bit, and then it can come back again. But that really helped me and gave me hope, because I thought, oh, okay, I could ease up on myself a bit of feeling like I should have a handle on this by now. And that was really helpful to me.
Yeah. And I think what I said to you, Esther, is that each time the wave comes again, and it normally comes unexpectedly, and there's a trigger, just something, you just see a picture, or like you said, you're walking down the street and you think you see your mom, or you
Mm,
just, just something happens, you're watching the film and then psh, it's there and it's flooding out of you. But I think what, in my experience, is it comes in waves, but each time that wave comes, it's just slightly better. It's
yes.
slightly less. And then eventually you do kind of come to a place where that horrible pain of grief. I really love the scripture where it says, surely, in Isaiah 63, I think it's verse 4 or something, and it says, surely he, talking about the Christ, has borne our grief and carried our sorrow. That there is, the divine will carry away your grief and your sorrow. So yeah, I think us fighting ourselves is never the way forward with trauma. That we allow ourselves to experience it and we accept this is where we are. Everyone else wants to make you better. No, you shouldn't be feeling like that. Come on, put a smile on. No, it's time to mourn. There's a time for everything under the sun. There's a time to laugh. There's a time to cry. I remember going to a funeral, one of my friends, when we all worked together, just in his 20s, and he had a car crash, and all of the lads was at the funeral, and one of my friends was cracking jokes. And I said to him, it's not time for jokes.
Mm,
Time to mourn. And he
yeah.
said, that's just trying to cheer us up. I said, it's not time for that.
No.
We need to mourn. We've lost our friend. And he got it. Because it's not the British thing to do, to have a sad face and
Yeah.
to mourn. And it's interesting what you're saying also about everything's tainted. Like, I think this is important, Esther, because there might be someone who watches this for the first time and they've just lost someone, or maybe they haven't experienced grief yet. And just to know, like, you may well feel like nothing will ever taste good again. No part of life will ever feel the same again. This has ruined everything. I think that's a real important thing to know, that, even if I get married, even if I have children, you were thinking, it's just not going to be the same.
Yeah.
Um, Now, and I don't think that is the case, Esther. Like, you have a beautiful child, you're married, you're doing stuff. What you felt back then to that degree, I wouldn't say that's it's not the truth, is it?
No, it's not. And it, it's there, but in a very I don't know if manageable is the right word, manageable form, that it's not like I thought it would be. Then yes, you miss that person and you're aware on the big events in life especially that they're missing, but it's not deep despair, it's not agonizing pain. There is enjoyment in those things even though you miss that person. And
Yeah.
I think I would have wanted to hear that when I was in that place. And I think that, I know when we were talking about this in the week, I was sort of saying I went into total despair. For me, it was the end of everything. And at that time, and you were saying, why is it, do you think, that you felt that? Because not everyone experiences grief like that. That's not the same for everyone. And I think, thinking about it, that must have meant that in some way I had an unhealthy connection with my mum. Not that I would ever have said that at the time. I'd have been like, what do you mean? But I think that comes from when you're so close with someone that then the loss of them means that you cannot imagine or you can't do life without them.
Yeah. Such an important point, Esther. And it's to do with our identity, I think. I mean, I'm no expert, but this is just uh, from my experience of life, I would say it's very much to do with identity. Now, I'm very interested in the story in the Bible with Jacob, when he loses his son Joseph, and they come back with the 11 brothers come back, and they say, look, we found his clothes, it's all blood, he's been torn by a wild beast. And so Jacob thinks his son's dead. Joseph's dead. Really, the boys have sold him for money and he's somewhere in Egypt. So anyway, the scripture says that he refused to be comforted. In other words, in my understanding, he refused to go through the process of grief, which they understood back then. And
Mm.
he said, I will go to my grave mourning. So and it says, because his soul was bound in the soul of his child. There was this, we would in our Christian language call it a soul tie. He had this unhealthy tie with, he identified his enjoyment in life with being with his son, and his son being there. And just like what we felt when my sister died and when your mom died, life will never be this. We could not imagine life without these people. And that's
Mm.
what he felt like. And I think what's important with grief, Esther, and this is the bit that probably people won't like me saying, is that there is some purpose in grief. Otherwise, if if it is that we just go on feeling terrible for the rest of our life and everything's rubbish, then we're in a bit of trouble, because we live in a world where we're constantly losing. I mean, one thing about death, we all, as far as I know, are going to face it. We're either going to lose someone, or we've lost someone, And like you said, it's not just death. You might lose your house, you might lose your job, and all the faith people will say, "No way, I don't believe that." Okay, but it may happen. And I think this, what life has taught me is we are constantly losing. Nothing you taste, hear, see, smell, nothing in this physical world will last. It's all passing, it's all transient. So if my identity is locked in a thing, oh, I'm a doctor, one day you won't be a doctor because they don't have doctors that are 96 years of age. You know, you're not going to be able to say, I'm a doctor, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm the prime minister, or whoever. You know, we're going to lose. We're going to lose each other. We're going to lose people. Life is full of, and even as you go through life, the older you get, again, the faith people are not going to like this, but people lose. They're not as strong as they were. You can't see it. Look, I've got these, you know, angioma. I mean, I need glasses now just to see you here, Esther. No, not all of us are great men of faith. Some of us are just ordinary people. But you know, my son said you need to get your ears tested. You know, so we lose constantly, is what I'm saying. But I think the key thing here is if our identity is wrapped up in people or things or position or anything that we can latch on to, that this is who we are, I think that's where the problem is. Because when we lose it, we now feel like we have lost a part of ourself, like a part of us has died, and now there's no point. And so we got to get used to losing stuff, so that when that goes, we can grab the next thing that God's got for us. And I think that's why with grief in particular, as C.S. Lewis talked about, is the fear element. Because every time you have to let go of something and embrace the unknown, there is fear. But that is your spiritual growth. And I always, when I try and talk to people about grief, not being an expert, but I always try to help them to release that person. Come to a place. Now, they have to come to that place where you can't force them to let go. But I don't know if I tried to do that with you, Esther, and help you, but to hand that person over to divinity, over to our God, knowing that the one thing that is eternal is us. I mean, I think this is why we grieve, because there's something in us that knows that this shouldn't happen. Like we're not supposed to disappear off the earth. That's just not meant to happen. I think we know that deep in our spirits. So there's a part of us that, you know, and it's bound up in love. It's bound up in love, that we never lose anyone. We never lose. You don't lose that which is eternal. We are connected. We will forever be connected. We are one. We're one in spirit. We're one with God, and you cannot lose. You know, so I think the first two deaths I had to face, my sister and my dad, that was, I didn't deal with them well at all. But when it came to my mum, I was getting used to life. I was getting used to, like, this is how life is. And I remember saying to someone, it's okay, because I will see her again. And in my mind, I just thought, like, it's only a matter of time. I almost felt like she's gone to another country and I will go to her at some point. It's just a matter of time. I will see her again. And this is our hope as well. So, yeah.
That's
Any reactions to that, Esther?
Yeah, I was thinking of the strange process of grief is first you grieve the physical loss of something, but something in your heart rises up to try and keep a hold of that person. I'm relating it to a person, but it can be anything. So for me, I'd physically lost my mum, but then my heart went on this course of keeping her alive. I'm not going to let go. And it's
Yeah.
almost like a need for control as well. And I think you described it really well. So first you deal with the loss of that person physically, and you react to that in anger and denial, or the struggle. But then my heart went on a course of, um, I'm not going to let her go inside. And I wasn't even consciously aware of that. But sometime a few years later, somebody else had said to me, with the same kind of ministry or awareness that you have, Roy, they said, every time you talk about your mum, you still struggle with tears. And maybe the time has come to say goodbye to her in your heart. And everything in me was like, no way, no way. That's the only place I have her. But I remembered that at that time I was also having some dreams. And in the dream, my mum would be in the dream every night, and she would be waving goodbye to me. And I knew it was a goodbye because very often she was in a boat and I was standing on the shore, and she would be waving and saying goodbye, and the boat would be withdrawing. And I'd be like, no, come back, come back. And we don't have time for this tonight. It's a very weird experience, really, that this would be happening in my dreams. So with her, we sat down and I had a conversation with my mum to say, sounds very odd, but it really helps. Say, I think I need to say goodbye to you. I will see you again, and I'm going to carry on with my life. And it was very hard, but it was another step in the process that needed to happen. And actually from that came great release, I think. I didn't feel guilty about living. I didn't feel guilty about enjoying anything. I didn't feel guilty about the fact that there were some things that I would laugh at, or I can't quite describe it, but it's a very important thing to happen. But it can only happen, like you say, when you're ready for your heart to, it feels like it's letting go, but you're not losing them anymore. But it feels like that in the moment.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as well, also, sometimes people, like I'd mentioned before, can be experiencing grief about something else, but not necessarily aware of it. I've been through actually a grieving process for my childhood, which is a whole different ballgame, and it sounds very strange, but because I was abused for quite a few years growing up, I realized a few years ago I couldn't look at a photograph of myself as a little girl, without this emotion coming up and this great sorrow. And I didn't deal with it, but I realized actually there's grief about things. I lost my innocence. I wasn't able to experience a carefree childhood. And there's lots of grief for different things, aren't there, Roy? Like you mentioned, that sometimes we can bottle up grief because we feel we're not allowed to grieve the loss of something else. But your heart still needs to do that.
Yeah, definitely. This experience of, you see, with trauma, immediately we can recognize trauma, can't we? Because we never want to face it. It's like the one thing, I don't want to go there. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to look at it. I'm not going to allow myself to feel it. See you later. But it doesn't get rid of it. It's just a big distraction. So part of the method, part of this journey, we're talking about stuff, and we're not saying people have to come public and talk about all their problems and their trauma. But I think what we are saying, Esther, is we do need to face the effects of what's happened. I was talking to someone, they said, I don't want to think about what's happened. My head can't take it. It's just too much. And I'm not saying that we need to think about it either. But there is stuff happening in our body. And I think we need to bring that into our conscious awareness.
Yeah.
Rather than keep going, keep distracting ourselves, keep busy. Because what happens is, how long are you going to keep busy, feeling horrible? Eventually you get tired. Eventually you just can't keep doing what you're doing, So wouldn't it be better for us to take our time and start looking at some of these techniques of how can I face this? Now, the thing is, in our childhood, we can't handle these things.
Mm.
So part of our defense mechanism, this is my understanding, is we block it, which is wonderful because it's just too much. It will kill us. So we just block it. But are we using a childhood mechanism in the second part of our life where we're not kids anymore?
Yeah.
But it feels like it's too, because as a kid, we know like this is going to kill me. I can't go there. So, and it feels the same now as we're adults. But I want to say, I don't think it's going to kill you. I don't think you need to think about it, your traumas, and go through it. I just don't feel you need to do that. And in our experience, Esther, we've not done that. But we have faced what's happening in our body now.
Yeah.
So this is the toxic past that's living in pain in my body, in my emotions, and so on. And as I begin to be able to sit with what is happening in my body and to see what has happened to me, what I've been through, what's been done to me isn't me. I think that's where the key is, that I was saying to someone the other day, I was talking to someone, I said, look, and I was outside walking, I said, I'm looking at a tree right now. And the fact I can look at it must mean I'm not the tree. If I can look at it. So if you can look at this pain, if you can look at it instead of running away from it and avoiding it, then it must mean you're not it.
Yeah.
You are, I believe we're divine, Esther. I believe we sit in our spirit and watch what happens in our bodies. And when we do that, I think something greater in us rises than that which has happened to us. And it dissolves it. Isn't that our experience, Esther? Haven't we,
Yeah.
this is real stuff, isn't it?
Definitely. And the thought of it sounds absolutely terrifying because your whole life, or for many years, you've avoided these very things, like you said. And the last thing that you want to contemplate is looking at these things because that seems unbearably painful, absolutely terrifying. But it's the opposite of that. It's actually the opposite of that. There is a place of peace in those things. And I'm really excited actually that next week we're going to be doing that. We're going to be looking at that. How do you turn all this toxicity that you've been living with and fighting and containing, battling and struggling with? Isn't it exhausting? That actually we're going to look at next week how you turn all of that into a purposeful now. So it doesn't have to be next year or, maybe in 5 years' time, I'll have processed it all. That's why we called this series, didn't we, A Purposeful Now. So really hope that you're going to tune in next week because we're going to be moving to that step and that stage. But I wanted to, Roy, as you know, our good friend Beverley, she's been joining us every week on the comments. She's been sharing her thoughts and it's really encouraged us. And we thought, actually, let's bring her in tonight and she can give us her thoughts or reflections on what we've been discussing about grief. She's all the way over in South Africa. So let's welcome her now. Beverley Du Toit, are you there?
Hi, I'm here.
Hey,
Hi guys, thank you so
It's
much
good to have you
for
here
allowing
in
me
person.
to chat to you. Yeah.
So you've been listening in, haven't you, Beverley?
Yeah, I have.
Do you have any thoughts about what we've been saying?
Yeah, I've got like a few things that I was thinking, and it's almost stuff that you guys have said, but maybe just from a different perspective. So like sort of, saying the same thing just in a different way.
Brilliant.
But one of the things that really struck me as you guys were talking is that what about if grief, how negatively we sort of view it and how painful and hard it can be, but what about if grief is actually the antidote to trauma? That there's a psychotherapist that I love his work called Gabor Mate, and he speaks about this kind of idea of grief as an antidote to trauma. And he says that when you look at how trauma develops, it's actually part of it is a resistance to grief. And like Roy was saying, that in childhood, that resistance to grief, children can't help that. It's that there's been something so hard that's going on, something so painful and so horrible, whether that's it might be something like an abuse, or it might be something like a neglect, not necessarily like an overt some that might not be he calls it like capital T trauma. It might be like a small T trauma if you want to sort of like grade them in that sort of way. And he says that the trauma arises not necessarily because of what's happened, but because of the lack of the capability to process what's happened. So as a child, you can't big things happen, these painful things happen, and you can't process them. And because you're unable to process them, they then become this traumatic thing. And what happens is that we then develop these coping mechanisms that are negative to try and to silence this thing, because we haven't processed it, we haven't sat with it, and we haven't really experienced the sadness. And as a child, you're not in the emotional space, you're not in the developmental space in your head to deal with it. But then you grow and you develop, and you live your life, but your brain starts creating these patterns of, this is how I deal with negative events. I cope by addictive habits, or I cope by whatever X, Y, and Z that's negative. And our brain it's kind of wired to just to love consistency. Like, it just loves what it knows. And so now when we're older, we're starting to be like, well, I want to sit with this idea of what happened to me when I was younger, or who did I lose, or whatever these griefs and traumas might be. Your brain is kind of like, no. I know survival is my procrastinating, my perfectionism, my addiction. That's how I survive. It's brought me this far. I don't want to, your brain is talking. I don't want to leave the things that I've consistently know that have brought me and kept me safe. But what about actually grieving is the antidote to that trauma? Sitting with the sadness and really feeling it, and coming to terms and actually processing what happened, realizing that these events, whether they're deaths and losses, that they've meant that our lives don't look the same, that they meant that our lives don't look how we would have hoped. Like our childhood, maybe we didn't have the love or attention that we would have hoped. Just actually processing those things. And what about if he says something like, what about if coming to terms with reality helps us to kind of dissolve the trauma that's sitting in our body. And so, like, I think, like you were saying, Roy, that grief has a purpose. It has a purpose. It's us processing that these things are wrong. And from a spiritual perspective, it's our spirit knowing that these things are not right. This isn't. There's a scripture. Gosh, I can't remember specifically what it says now, but Jesus is talking about marriage, and they're talking about and people are asking him, about divorce, and he says something along, paraphrasing now, that in the beginning it was not so. He says, there's a right to divorce, but in the beginning it was not so. And there's like something inside of us knows that in the beginning it wasn't meant to be like this.
Right.
And so we feel the pain of that, because we know that it's not, grief as us processing that it's not really meant to be like this. I'm not meant to lose our loved ones. Life isn't meant to look like this, but in this world, that's what our experience is. So we have to process it before we can before it overcomes us in some way. And usually what happens is that we bring up these coping mechanisms that we don't even realize that that's what they are when we get older. They're just how we've always been. I've always been someone who does X, Y, and Z, and it becomes hard. And actually, people actually sometimes feel this whole, the concept of like cognitive dissonance, like you feel like almost resistant to doing something in a different way, because your brain is so much like hardwired now by all these years of programming, basically, of that's how you've always dealt with it. But on the other side of grieving and processing what we've gone through is actually freedom. I think that on the other side of grief is freedom.
What would you say about someone, because one thing I've noticed about Trust Talks just so far, it'd be good to get your reaction on what we're doing, because we're not trying to come here with anything professional. We're just sharing stories, and we're trying to talk about things that we don't normally, our community doesn't really talk about. these are all kind of buried things. But one of the things that I'm seeing already is some people are saying like, this is too much. I mean, I've even seen, I can't watch your program. I started watching it. No, you know, and I've had some people, you know, say that to me, that I cannot go. No, don't even go there with me. I'm not watching it. You know, it triggered too much.
Mm.
You know, what would you say to them, Bev?
Gosh, I think I would say like, I think I would say that like, first of all, sometimes like that's okay, that it triggered
Yeah,
that's, I think we have to appreciate that people are at different points of their journey, I think, in their healing and in their processing of the different things that they've gone through in their lives. And I think I'd get them to maybe think about like, just think about why does it feel like too much for them? And I think that's a point. That's something
yeah,
that you were saying, Roy, is that if we have to develop that conscious awareness. So we're like looking at ourselves and realizing as we look at ourselves, sorry, my washing machine is on and it's just going really, really loud. I don't know if you can hear it now. So it's like an airplane is going off. So that if we developing that conscious awareness of looking at ourselves and we realize that when we're looking at our issues, it's not actually us. So if they just ask themselves, just why do you feel like that? Because
right,
sometimes it's just a matter of asking yourself, why is it that I've always dealt with this issue like this? And
right,
sometimes it's just, I don't know, for me, just to give you a bit of context, like for me, like becoming a mum has been a major thing in starting in this journey of kind of dealing with like past hurts and past experiences and stuff. And the first question for me was like, why does it really trigger me when my son does something like this? Like,
mhm,
why? It's not what he's doing. It's something that it brings out in me. And so sometimes it's just asking that why, get them to just
yeah,
think about why is it? And then they start to actually look. And sometimes that's the first step in realizing that something is going on. Like,
yeah,
it's not just that this is a hard conversation, which it is, but it's that it's bringing up something from my
yeah,
past or from something that I've gone through. And that's often a good first step to realize that because we all think we're okay, I think.
yeah,
Sometimes we think we're okay. We've survived, we're here.
yeah,
We don't realize there's a lot of struggle still going on in our lives, but we've plastered over it with all this coping mechanism. So sometimes getting them to ask why gets them to realize that, oh, actually, maybe there's something is going on and I need
yeah.
to talk about it. Or
And I think when we ask why, what it does is it shows us, as we begin to experience and look at things, that it doesn't define us.
mm,
It's not who we are.
mhm.
We're separate from it. Would you agree with that, Bev? That there is a difference between what's happened to us and when we ask why, we are because all the time before we just identify it. We say, I feel
Yeah.
this, and I think this, and I'm this,
Mm,
and that, you know, and we've never separated ourselves from it.
mhm, mhm. I think, yeah, feelings are something that we experience. They're not actually who we are. They're just something that we experience. They can highlight things, they can be signposts to things, but they're not who we are. Definitely. The things that have happened to us, the things that we feel, they're not who we are. Yeah.
And I think
Fantastic.
that's the important thing about what we're going to do next week as well, is that there's a difference between looking at these things and saying, yes, this happened to me, rather than looking at
Mm,
these things and saying, this is me, this is who I
mm,
am. There's such
mm.
a profound life-changing difference between those two things. And I'm really looking forward to next week, to us expanding more on that. And you're going to share some techniques as well, aren't you, Roy,
I'm
about
gonna try.
yes. So tune in next week. I just want to give a minute though, if there's anyone watching this who wants to respond to anything that we've talked about, anything that we've shared, please do right now. We would love to see your comments. We will also pick up on your comments even after this is live. So if you're watching this later on, then let us know your thoughts and feelings, because we really appreciate your feedback. Like I said, next week we'll be back here. But thank you, Beverley, so much for joining us. We
Thank
hope
you,
that you'll
guys.
be back as well, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and your feelings. It's great to actually have you here in person, but thank you for your comments that you've given us in the last few weeks. It's so encouraging.
Yeah, amazing.
Thank you guys for just sharing and doing this. I think it's such a good platform that you're giving for people to hear your stories and also to share what's going on in their lives as well.
Yeah, well, it's not, like Roy said before, it's not easy, but the whole purpose is that we believe that someone watching needed to hear this today. So we hope that we've encouraged you and told you or reminded you that there can be a change in this depth of despair that you're in. There can be a very different life. And we'll be with you next week. And I think what I wanted to say was, again, if anyone's happy just to give us a little subscribe so that you'll catch us next week, because next week is coming to the good stuff. You know, you've stuck with us through some difficult things. But also, we're aware that for somebody watching this, and people who have watched it, right now might not be the right time for you to deal with some of this stuff. If there's a resistance in you, then come back to it. Remember these things we've been talking about and watch it again when you feel able. They're not comfortable subjects, but we're with you on this journey, and it's going to help you when you're ready for it to help you. So all I can say is thank you so much, all of you who've tuned in, those who watched it later. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Beverley. We will see you next week for the 5th part in our series of how to turn a toxic past into a purposeful now, where we'll be getting to the good about how you turn all of that bad stuff into this good, purposeful life right now. So we'll see you next Thursday at 7:30 for Trust Talks.
Thank you for watching Trust Talks by the Purim Trust. To find out more about the work that we do supporting vulnerable women and children, you can go to thepurimtrust.org and get involved with building hope in the lives of those who need it.